There are people who understand before anyone tells them that the machinery they serve was not built to protect the truth. They feel it in the gap between what they are ordered to do and what they are told the order means. They carry this knowledge alone because speaking it aloud ends careers, destroys families, makes a person disappear from official memory. Some of them choose silence and live with the cost. Others cannot. Before we go further, I want to hear from you. Have you ever been part of something where the official story and your lived experience were completely different things? Where you knew what actually happened but were told to remember it another way? Drop your answer in the comments below. I read every one. And while you listen, think about what it costs a person to carry two versions of the same event for the rest of their life. The spring of 1991 in northern Iraq was not the spring of celebrations that played on American television screens. The war had ended. The ceasefire had been signed. But the ground itself did not recognize these distinctions. The Euphrates River Valley, where it cuts through limestone plateaus near the Syrian border, held a temperature during March that fluctuated 40 degrees between midday and pre-dawn. The wind came from the northwest carrying dust that got into everything: weapons, eyes, the seals on water containers. The light at that latitude and season produced a particular quality of shadow, hard-edged, absolute. A man standing in sun was visible for miles. A man standing in shadow disappeared completely. The terrain was not hospitable to large military operations, which made it ideal for the kind of operations that could not be officially acknowledged. Rock formations rose from otherwise flat ground, creating natural cover for small units. Wadis cut through the landscape in patterns that made sense only to people who had studied them from above. There were no towns large enough to appear on standard military maps. There were encampments, temporary structures, populations that moved with the seasons and the security conditions. The nearest acknowledged American base was 3 hours by helicopter, farther by ground vehicle, assuming the roads were passable and the checkpoints were friendly. This was the landscape where certain operations occurred that would later be described in heavily redacted documents as intelligence gathering in support of ongoing regional stability efforts. The language meant very little. The operations themselves were conducted by people who understood that the official phrasing and the actual mission often had no relationship to each other. They went where they were sent. They did what they were ordered to do. Most of them came back and folded the experience into the parts of their memory they did not discuss. A few did not come back at all, and one, according to the fragmentary record that survives, chose not to. Major David Sinclair stood 6 feet and 1 inch tall, with the build of a man who had spent 2 decades moving through mountains under load. Not the bulk of a weightlifter, the lean mass of someone who climbed 20-mile ridgelines carrying 80 pounds, and did it often enough that the body rebuilt itself for exactly that task. His hands were large, scarred across the knuckles from cold weather operations where gloves were too thick to work in and bare skin split against metal in sub-zero temperatures. The calluses on his palms were not uniform. The left hand showed thickening along the base of the fingers where a rifle stock rested during long carries. The right hand had different wear patterns, concentrated on the thumb and forefinger, the specific damage that comes from thousands of hours of precision manipulation, loading magazines, adjusting optics, working small mechanical components in conditions that destroyed fine motor control. His face carried the asymmetry that comes from broken bones that healed without medical intervention. The left side of his jaw sat slightly lower than the right, the result of an impact during mountain training in Alaska in 1984 that he did not report because reporting it would have pulled him from the training cycle. The break healed on its own over 6 weeks. It changed how his face looked when he was thinking. His hair was cut to military standard. Dark brown going to gray at the temples earlier than his age suggested. His eyes were pale gray, the color of overcast sky, and they had the quality of someone who was always measuring distances and calculating routes, even when standing still. The psychology behind those eyes was harder to parse, and not because it was complicated. Sinclair trusted physical systems, terrain, weather, the mechanics of weapons and navigation. He did not trust institutional systems, but he had spent 20 years working within them because he understood that distrust of a system and refusal to operate within it were different things. He carried a question he had been unable to answer since 1972, when he was 16 years old, and watched his father, a decorated Korea veteran, be denied benefits for an injury the VA claimed was not service-connected despite documentary evidence to the contrary. The question was this: if the institution will not honor its stated commitments when honoring them is inconvenient, what is the institution actually committed to? He had never put the question down. It was the lens through which he understood every order, every briefing, every official explanation that did not quite fit the observable facts. He kept journals, which was against regulations for someone with his clearance level. He kept them anyway, and hid them in places where official searches would not think to look. The journals were not confessional. They were operational logs, written in shorthand, recording details that official after-action reports left out. The weather conditions that made a mission harder than briefed, the intelligence that turned out to be wrong, the orders that changed mid-operation without explanation, the names of people who were present but did not appear in the final documentation. He wrote in them because he had learned that official memory was selective, and he wanted a record that was not. The world Sinclair inhabited in the spring of 1991 was one of overlapping jurisdictions and competing priorities that were never fully explained to the people conducting the operations. Delta Force answered to Joint Special Operations Command. JSOC answered to the Secretary of Defense. But in theater, during the transitional period after the ceasefire, operations were also being run by the CIA, by military intelligence units operating semi-independently, by liaison officers working with foreign governments whose interests did not align with stated American policy. A mission briefing might come from official channels. The actual operational orders might come from someone else entirely. And the after-action report, when it was filed at all, would describe a third thing that had very little relationship to what had actually occurred. There were 12 other operators in Sinclair's unit during the March to June period. Most of them rotated through. 3 stayed for the duration. Sergeant First Class Marcus Webb had worked with Sinclair since Germany in '87. He was the kind of NCO who read orders for what they did not say and adjusted his actions accordingly without needing to be told. Captain Brian Foster was the official unit commander, younger than Sinclair, competent in the technical sense, but without the years of experience that taught a person when to question the briefing, and Lieutenant Sarah Grant, intelligence liaison, who was not Delta but was attached to the unit for reasons that were never fully clarified. She had access to classified information the rest of the unit did not. She received briefings separately, and she had the authority to change operational parameters without consulting the unit commander, which suggested she answered to someone other than the person whose name appeared on the organizational chart. The local population, to the extent that the unit interacted with them, were not hostile in the way that term had been used during the active combat phase. They were watchful. They understood that foreign military presence in their territory meant something was happening that would affect them, and they responded by providing no information, no assistance, and no resistance that would draw attention. There were shepherds who moved flocks through the area. There were traders who ran routes between unofficial markets. There were people who lived in structures that could be dismantled and moved when security conditions changed. None of them acknowledged the Americans except to step off the road when vehicles approached. And all of them, Sinclair noted in his journal, seemed to know where the Americans were going before the Americans arrived. Power in that landscape did not work the way it worked in official briefings. The briefings spoke of Allied forces and cooperative local authorities. The reality was that control was fragmented among groups whose alliances shifted based on factors the Americans were not privy to. A route that was safe one week was not safe the next, not because of enemy action, but because an agreement had expired, or a payment had not been made, or someone's cousin had been insulted in a way that required a response. The unit learned to read these shifts not from intelligence reports, but from the behavior of the local population, how far women walked from their compounds to draw water, whether children were visible during the day, how many vehicles were moving on roads that were usually empty. It was in the second week of April, 11 days after the official ceasefire, that Sinclair received orders that did not come through normal channels. He was alone in the operations tent when Lieutenant Grant brought him a folder that was not marked with standard classification headers. She did not hand it to him. She set it on the table, told him to read it there, and left without speaking. The folder contained coordinates for a location 38 kilometers northwest of their current position, a structure that did not appear on any map Sinclair had access to, and instructions to conduct reconnaissance without notifying the unit commander or logging the mission in official records. The orders specified that he was to go alone. They specified a 2-hour window for insertion and extraction, and they specified that any materials recovered were to be delivered directly to Lieutenant Grant, not processed through normal intelligence channels. Sinclair read the orders twice. He checked the coordinates against his maps. The location was inside Syrian territory, which meant any operation there was not only unacknowledged, but illegal under the terms of engagement that had been briefed to the unit. He looked for the authorizing signature. There was none. He looked for operational justification. The document said only Intelligence Priority Alpha, which was not a classification he recognized. He sat with the folder for 20 minutes, reading it again, checking details, and then he did what the orders specified. He did not ask questions. He logged the mission as a personal reconnaissance exercise, which was within his authority, and did not require command approval, and he went. The days before that mission had established a rhythm that Sinclair understood. Pre-dawn briefings, where very little information was actually conveyed. Equipment checks that were more ritual than necessity because the equipment never changed. Patrols that covered the same routes every 72 hours, predictable enough that the local population knew when to expect them. Meals that came from the same rotation of prepackaged rations, eaten at the same times, with the same complaints about the same contents. The waiting, which was most of what the job involved. Sitting in shade during the heat of the day, moving during the cooler hours, monitoring radio traffic that was mostly procedural updates about nothing in particular. The landscape itself was beautiful in a way that the official briefings never mentioned. The way the light hit the rock formations at sunset, turning limestone gold and red. The silence after dark, so complete that you could hear your own pulse. The stars, visible in quantities that Sinclair had not seen since Montana, so dense that the Milky Way looked like fog. During the waiting periods, he walked the perimeter, checked equipment he had already checked, wrote in his journal, and watched the horizon for changes that would indicate something was moving toward them. It was not hard work. It was not dangerous work in the conventional sense. It was work that required attention without providing stimulation, which was its own kind of exhausting. The first anomaly was small enough that Sinclair almost did not note it. On April 16th, during a routine patrol, the unit encountered a checkpoint that had not been there 3 days earlier. The checkpoint was manned by personnel wearing insignia Sinclair did not recognize. Not Iraqi Regular Army, not Kurdish Peshmerga, not any of the militia groups the intelligence briefings had covered. When Sergeant Webb asked who they were working for, the response was a name that meant nothing to anyone in the unit. The checkpoint waved them through without inspection, which was itself unusual. Checkpoints existed to control movement. This one seemed to exist only to be visible. Sinclair noted the location and the description of the personnel. When he asked Lieutenant Grant about it that evening, she said the checkpoint was friendly and offered no additional information. When he asked Captain Foster, Foster said he had no intelligence about checkpoints in that area and suggested Sinclair file a report. Sinclair did not file a report. He added the details to his journal and marked the entry with a symbol he used for things that did not fit the pattern. 4 days later, on a resupply run, the same checkpoint was gone, no trace of it. No vehicle tracks indicating it had moved. The ground where it had been showed no evidence of recent occupation. Sinclair walked the area looking for shell casings, trash, disturbed soil, anything that would confirm the checkpoint had been real. He found nothing. He mentioned this to Sergeant Webb, who had also been on the original patrol. Webb confirmed he remembered the checkpoint. He also confirmed there was no evidence it had ever existed. Neither of them reported it. They did not discuss it further. But Sinclair noted in his journal that the absence of evidence was as strange as the original presence had been. The radio traffic began to change around the same time. Sinclair was not supposed to be monitoring certain frequencies, but he had long ago learned that official restrictions on information flow meant that official information was incomplete. He listened to channels that were designated for command-level communication. What he heard were references to operations that did not appear in any briefing the unit received, code names for missions no one had explained, coordinates that were well outside the acknowledged area of operations, and conversations that ended abruptly when someone realized the channel was not secure. On April 22nd, Sinclair heard a transmission that included the phrase "Asset Retrieval Northern Corridor," followed by a grid coordinate he recognized as being inside Syrian territory. The transmission was brief, less than 30 seconds, and it was followed by a long period of radio silence on that frequency. Asset retrieval was not a term used for personnel recovery. It was used for equipment or intelligence materials. But the tone of the transmission suggested urgency, which equipment recovery did not typically warrant. Sinclair noted the coordinate. It was 6 kilometers from the location he had been ordered to reconnaissance solo. He did not mention the transmission to anyone. He checked the operational logs to see if any mission had been filed for that area. There was nothing. He checked again after 72 hours. Still nothing. Which meant either the operation had not happened, which contradicted the radio traffic, or the operation had happened and was not being logged, which contradicted every protocol the unit was supposed to follow. Lieutenant Grant began spending more time away from the unit, leaving for briefings she did not explain, and returning with instructions that changed operational plans without providing operational justification. On April 25th, she told Captain Foster that the unit would be moving to a new position, 30 kilometers south of their current location. Foster asked for the reason. Grant said it was a command decision, and the reason was classified. Foster accepted this. The unit moved. The new position had no tactical advantage that Sinclair could identify. It was farther from water. The sight lines were worse. The defensive perimeter was harder to secure. When he asked Webb what he thought, Webb said the move made no sense unless someone wanted them away from a specific area. When Sinclair asked what area, Webb pointed northwest in the direction of the coordinates Sinclair had been given for the solo reconnaissance. The unit had been in the new position for 3 days when Sinclair saw the helicopters, 2 of them flying low and fast, heading northwest. They were not American models. They were not any model Sinclair recognized from the intelligence briefings on Soviet or French aircraft. They passed over the unit's position without slowing and disappeared beyond the ridgeline. Sinclair checked the radio frequencies for traffic about the helicopters. There was none. He asked Lieutenant Grant if she had information about air traffic in the area. She said she did not. He asked if he should file a report. She said it was not necessary. That night, Sinclair could not sleep. He lay in his tent and ran through the pattern he had been watching accumulate, the checkpoint that appeared and vanished, the radio traffic about operations that were not logged, the move to a new position with no tactical justification, the helicopters that no one acknowledged, and the orders he had received to conduct a solo reconnaissance to a location that was now clearly connected to something larger than he had been told. He got up at 0300 hours and walked the perimeter. The guard on duty was a specialist named Torres, who was good at his job and did not ask unnecessary questions. Sinclair nodded to him. Torres nodded back. Sinclair walked to the edge of the camp where the ground dropped away into a shallow valley. The stars were out. The air was cool enough that he could see his breath. And in the distance, northwest, he saw lights. Not many, just a few, small and steady, in a location where the maps showed nothing. He watched the lights for 20 minutes. They did not move. They did not change intensity. They were too steady to be campfires. They looked like electric lights, which meant a structure with a generator, which meant a permanent or semi-permanent installation. He noted the bearing and estimated the distance. It matched the coordinates from the solo reconnaissance order. He returned to his tent and added the observation to his journal. The next morning, Lieutenant Grant called Sinclair to the operations tent. She was not alone. There was a man Sinclair had never seen before, wearing civilian clothes, no identification. Grant did not introduce him. The man told Sinclair that the reconnaissance mission had been moved up. He was to go that night, instead of waiting for the originally scheduled window. Sinclair asked, why? The man said the answer was classified. Sinclair asked who was authorizing the change. The man said that was also classified. Sinclair looked at Lieutenant Grant. She looked back at him without expression. Sinclair said he needed to brief Sergeant Webb on his absence. The man said no briefing was necessary. The mission would be over before his absence was noticed. Sinclair said he needed to log the mission for operational continuity. The man said the mission was already logged in a system Sinclair did not have access to. Sinclair stood there for a long moment, looking at Grant, looking at the civilian, understanding that he was being asked to operate completely outside the normal chain of command and completely outside the normal documentation systems. He asked one more question. He asked what he was looking for at the target location. The man smiled. He said Sinclair would know it when he saw it. He said to bring back any documents, any electronic media, any materials that looked like they did not belong. He said not to engage anyone he encountered unless engagement was unavoidable. And he said if anything went wrong, the mission had never been authorized, and Sinclair had been acting on his own initiative. Sinclair said he understood. The man left. Lieutenant Grant stayed. Sinclair asked her directly if she knew what this mission was actually about. She said she knew what she had been told, which was very little. He asked her if she trusted the authorization. She said trust was not relevant. He asked her what he should do if the mission did not go as briefed. She said to get himself out and deal with the consequences later. He left the operations tent and went to his gear. He checked his weapons, his navigation equipment, his emergency protocols. He filled 2 canteens instead of 1. He took extra ammunition, even though the briefing said no contact was expected, and he took his journal wrapped in plastic and hid it under a storage crate in a location where official searches would not find it, unless they were specifically looking for it. The infiltration went exactly as planned, which was the first indication that something was wrong. In Sinclair's experience, operations never went exactly as planned. There were always variables, weather changes, terrain obstacles, unexpected civilian presence. This time, there were none. The route to the target was clear. The security presence was absent. And when Sinclair reached the structure at the specified coordinates, the door was unlocked. Inside was not what he had been told to expect. The structure was not an intelligence collection site. It was a detention facility. There were 12 cells, 10 of them occupied. The occupants were not prisoners of war in any conventional sense. They were not Iraqi military. They were not insurgents. They appeared to be civilians, most of them badly injured, all of them in conditions that violated every protocol Sinclair had ever been trained on. There were medical supplies in the facility, but no medical personnel. There were documents written in English, detailing interrogations that used techniques Sinclair recognized from classified briefings as being specifically prohibited. He stood in the center of the facility for a full minute, processing what he was seeing. Then he began photographing. He used the camera he had been issued for reconnaissance documentation. He photographed the cells. He photographed the occupants. He photographed the documents. He moved methodically, room by room, creating a record that would be impossible to deny. In the last room, he found a log book. The entries were in English, written by American personnel, documenting activities that had occurred over a 3-month period. The log indicated that the facility was run by a joint CIA military intelligence unit that was not operating under any acknowledged command structure. The entries detailed interrogations, detentions, and transfers of prisoners to locations that were not identified. And the final entry, dated 2 days earlier, indicated that the facility was being shut down and all evidence was to be destroyed. Sinclair photographed every page of the log. Then he took the log itself, along with 3 other documents that appeared to be operational orders and intelligence summaries. He put them in his pack. He checked the time. He had been inside for 37 minutes. The extraction window was closing. He left the way he had come in. The route back was as clear as the route in had been. No security presence, no obstacles. When he reached the extraction point, he stopped and looked back at the facility. The lights were still on. The generator was still running. And he understood that he had been sent there not to gather intelligence, but to become a witness to something that was about to be erased. He returned to the unit position at 0400 hours. Lieutenant Grant was waiting. The civilian was gone. She asked if he had recovered materials. He said he had. She held out her hand. He did not give her the documents. He said he needed to debrief with Captain Foster first. She said that was not part of the mission protocol. He said it was part of his protocol. They stood there in the pre-dawn dark, neither of them moving. Finally, she said he could keep the materials until morning. Then they would need to be turned over for analysis. He said he understood. She left. He went to his tent. He did not sleep. He sat with the documents and read them in detail, understanding with each page that he had been made part of something that could not be officially acknowledged because officially acknowledging it would require explaining why it had been done. At 0600 hours, Sergeant Webb found him. Webb did not ask what was wrong. He sat down next to Sinclair and waited. After a long silence, Sinclair showed him the photographs. Webb looked through them without speaking. When he finished, he handed them back. He said one word: "Fuck." Sinclair asked Webb what he would do. Webb said he did not know. He said the smart thing would be to turn everything over to Grant and forget he had ever seen it. He said the right thing would be to report it through official channels and accept whatever consequences followed. And he said the thing that would actually happen was that Sinclair would make a decision and Webb would support it, because that was how this worked. Sinclair made his decision. He did not turn over the documents to Lieutenant Grant. He did not report through official channels. He kept the materials and continued his normal duties as if nothing had changed. For 3 days, nothing happened. Grant did not ask for the documents. The civilian did not return. The unit continued its patrols, and Sinclair waited to see what response his noncompliance would trigger. On May 2nd, at 1100 hours, Captain Foster called Sinclair to the operations tent. There were 2 men there Sinclair had never seen. They wore uniforms with no unit identification. Foster looked uncomfortable. One of the men told Sinclair that materials recovered during an unauthorized reconnaissance operation needed to be turned over immediately. Sinclair asked what operation they were referring to. The man said Sinclair knew exactly what operation. Sinclair said he had conducted no unauthorized operations. Everything he had done was within his operational authority. The conversation went in circles for 20 minutes. The men did not threaten. They did not raise their voices. They simply repeated in various formulations that Sinclair had materials that belonged to them and needed to return them. Sinclair repeated in various formulations that he did not have materials that belonged to them. Finally, the men left. Foster asked Sinclair what was happening. Sinclair said he did not know. Foster said he was being lied to by everyone involved, and he did not appreciate it. Sinclair said he agreed. That night, Sinclair took the documents and buried them outside the perimeter. He marked the location with a grid reference that only he could interpret and noted it in his journal using a code he had developed for exactly this kind of situation. Then he returned to his tent and waited. What happened next is reconstructed from multiple fragmentary sources because Sinclair himself left no direct account. According to Sergeant Webb's personal journal recovered decades later from his estate, Sinclair left the compound on the night of May 3rd without authorization and without logging his departure. Webb noticed his absence at 0200 hours during a routine tent check. He did not report it. He waited to see if Sinclair would return. According to radio intercepts that were declassified in 2014 with heavy redactions, there was communication traffic on the night of May 3rd that included references to an operator defection and containment protocols. The intercepts do not name individuals. The timestamps match the period of Sinclair's unauthorized absence. According to a deposition filed in 1998 by a former CIA contractor who requested anonymity, there was an incident in early May 1991 involving a Delta Force operator who had obtained documentation of a black site detention facility and was attempting to reach a neutral party who could verify the materials. The deposition indicates that the operator was intercepted before making contact. The deposition does not specify what happened after the intercept. According to military personnel records, Major David Sinclair was listed as missing in action on May 4, 1991. The circumstances of his disappearance are described as unknown. Investigation ongoing. The investigation file, if it exists, remains classified. On June 22, 1991, Sinclair's status was changed from missing in action to presumed deceased. No body was recovered. No death certificate was issued. The change in status is noted in the record without explanation. According to interviews conducted with Sinclair's family in 2021, military officials visited their home in Montana in late May 91. The officials asked for any personal materials Sinclair had sent home, particularly journals or correspondence. The family turned over a box of letters and 2 notebooks. The materials were never returned. When the family asked for clarification about Sinclair's status, they were told the matter was classified. When they asked if he was alive or dead, they were told the military could not confirm either way. The unit Sinclair had been assigned to was disbanded within 2 weeks of his disappearance. Personnel were reassigned to different commands scattered across multiple continents. Several members received psychological evaluations that were not part of their standard medical files. The evaluations were conducted by personnel who were not part of the normal military medical system. The results were classified separately from the individual service records. Sergeant Webb was reassigned to Germany. He served another 8 years and retired with full honors. In his personal journal, which his family donated to a military history archive after his death in 2016, there are entries from May 91 that refer to Sinclair only in initials. The entries indicate that Webb believed Sinclair had made a choice between complying with orders he could not accept and defecting with evidence he could not suppress. Webb wrote that he understood the choice. He wrote that he did not know if he would have had the courage to make it, and he wrote that he spent the rest of his career waiting for someone to ask him what he knew, and no one ever did. Lieutenant Grant left the military in 1992. She declined to be interviewed for this story. Captain Foster served until 2001, retired as a colonel, and died in 2018. His service record makes no mention of the April through June 91 period. His obituary describes a distinguished career with no gaps or anomalies. The detention facility Sinclair photographed was discovered by UN inspectors in 2003 during the lead-up to the Iraq War. By that time, the structure had been empty for years. The inspectors found no documents. The facility was described in their report as a structure of unknown origin and purpose. It was destroyed during the early phase of the invasion. The site no longer exists. Freedom of Information Act requests filed in 2007, 2010, and 2015 seeking information about Delta Force operations in northern Iraq between March and June 91 have been denied on grounds of national security. The denials cite active classified programs and ongoing operational security requirements. In 2019, a former State Department analyst published a paper examining gaps in the operational record of Gulf War intelligence activities. The paper notes that certain operations from the March through June 91 period are referenced in later intelligence assessments but have no corresponding documentation in the official record. The paper suggests that these gaps indicate a systematic effort to remove evidence of activities that were conducted outside legal and operational authority. The paper does not name individuals. It does not mention Sinclair. But the geographic coordinates it cites for one of the gaps correspond to the area where Sinclair conducted his final documented operation. Sinclair's mother spent the final 12 years of her life attempting to obtain information about her son's fate. She filed FOIA requests. She contacted congressional representatives. She hired private investigators. She published appeals in veteran newsletters. She received no answers. In her final interview, conducted 6 months before her death in 2020, she said she did not need to know what her son had done. She needed to know whether he was alive or dead. The military had never given her that information. She said she believed they withheld it not because they did not know, but because acknowledging it would require acknowledging what he had discovered. The documents Sinclair buried have never been recovered. The location he marked in his journal has been searched multiple times by researchers and journalists. Nothing has been found. It is possible the materials were recovered by the same people who came looking for them in May 91. It is possible they remain buried waiting for someone who knows where to look. It is possible Sinclair moved them before his disappearance. No one knows. What remains is a pattern that repeats across multiple unrelated sources. A man who was good at his job, a mission that did not make sense, a discovery that could not be acknowledged, a decision that made him disappear, and an institutional response that treated his existence as a problem to be managed rather than a person to be accounted for. There is something in that pattern that extends beyond one man in one war. It is the recognition that institutions protect themselves by erasing the people who expose contradictions between stated policy and actual practice. Sinclair found evidence that American personnel were operating a detention facility that violated American policy. The evidence was not disputed by making a counter-argument. It was disputed by making Sinclair vanish from the official record. His status is listed as deceased, but no one has ever explained how he died, where he died, or what happened to his remains. The only thing that is certain is that, after he obtained documentation of activities the institution could not acknowledge, he ceased to exist in any official sense. You carry a version of this every time you know something the official story contradicts, when your workplace history and the company narrative do not align, when your memory of an event and the authorized version are different things. When you are told to remember it the way it is written down rather than the way it happened. Most people choose to let the official version stand because fighting it costs more than accepting it. Sinclair could not make that choice, and the institution made its choice in response. I want to hear from you. Have you ever known someone who tried to expose something true and paid for it with their career or their reputation or their peace of mind? Have you ever been the person who stayed quiet because speaking up would have cost too much? Drop your thoughts in the comments. These stories matter. The official histories will not preserve them. We have to. If you found this valuable, subscribe. More stories like this are coming. The institutions that bury these histories are counting on people not caring enough to remember. Prove them wrong. Share this. Talk about it. And if you have family stories about operations that never made it into the official record, tell them in the comments. That is how this work continues. Thank you for listening.